Good afternoon, and welcome to the annual technical review workshop for the SONGS Wheeler North Reef Mitigation Project. My name is Kate Huckelbridge, and I am a Deputy Director for the Coastal Commission. Before I turn it over to Dan Reed and Steve Schroeder for the presentations today, I wanted to go over just a few logistical items related to the Zoom platform and describe how we will run the webinar. First, as I'm sure most of you are aware, this is our very first virtual webinar. We've done our very best to prepare, but as my difficulty with Wi-Fi this morning is any indication, we're still learning how to do this, and we ask for your patience as we try to address any problems that do crop up. Everyone attending the webinar, as you probably have noted, has been muted and will remain muted during the presentations. And video has been disabled for all attendees. If you have a question for the team, there will be two ways to ask your question. First, you can type a question into the Q&A box that you should see at the very bottom of your screen. When we come to the question and answer portion of the webinar, the team will walk through the questions as time allows and answer them verbally. Second, when we come to the question and answer portion of the webinar, you can also use the raise your hand function, which you should also hear at the bottom of your screen, to indicate that you would like to ask a question. I will then unmute you one at a time to ask your question of the team. We're going to do our very best to get to all the questions, but if we aren't able to answer everything, our team will try to put together brief written responses to be sent out after the webinar. If you were not able to ask your live question, or you just can't quite get the question out during the webinar, please feel free to reach out to one of our team members via phone or email with your questions, and we will respond to you directly. So with that, as you can see here, we're going to start off with an introduction to the SONGS Reef Mitigation Project provided by Steve Schroeder, project scientist out of UC Santa Barbara. And so I will turn it over to Steve.
Thanks, Kate. So I'm just to look at the agenda is here. So after the intro, Dan Reed is going to present the results of the 2019 performance monitoring of the Wheeler North Reef. And after Dan's presentation, there will be a 15-minute time period for questions and comments on the monitoring results. Following that period, Jenny McKee from Southern California Edison is going to give an overview and status of the expansion of the Wheeler North Reef. And that will be followed by 15-minute questions and comments on the reef expansion. And following that, there will be a period for general discussion. Okay. SONGS, the San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station, is located in North San Diego County. The reactors, the nuclear reactors of SONGS, units 2 and 3, shown up at the upper left, were cooled by seawater that is taken in by large intake pipes, shown on the right, upper right, and discharged back into the ocean via 2 diffuser lines. The SONGS Artificial Reef Mitigation Project is linked to the adverse effects of the SONGS cooling water discharges. Mixing of the discharge cooling water with the surrounding seawater was found to result in the formation of turbid plumes. You can see here on the right, the insert on the right, in the vicinity of the San Onofre kelp forest, which is outlined in the dashed green here. And just immediately south of the diffusers. The studies that were conducted from 1976 through 1987 by the Marine Review Committee determined that this turbid plume was the cause of substantial reduction in the area of the San Onofre kelp forest and had an impact on the biota in the forest. The California Coastal Act requires mitigation of marine impacts. California Coastal Commission is responsible for implementing the Coastal Act. As mitigation for the impacts of the San Onofre kelp forest caused by songs, the CCC required SCE to 1, construct an artificial reef large enough to support at least 28 tons of fish and 150 acres of kelp forest habitat to compensate for the losses of kelp, kelp bed fish, invertebrates, and algae. Secondly, to provide funding for scientific oversight and monitoring of the mitigation project that is independent of Southern California Edison. So on to the objectives. The objectives were to replace marine resources in the San Onofre kelp forests that were damaged or lost by the operation of songs units 2 and 3. The approach, as I said previously, is to build an artificial reef in sandy habitat that is low relief with topography and depth similar to the San Onofre kelp forest. That this artificial reef should be located near songs, but outside the influence of its discharge. The artificial reef was built in 2 phases, a small 22-acre short-term 5-year experimental phase to test different reef materials and designs. Following that, there was a large 150 acres or greater long-term, greater than 30-year mitigation phase to replace the kelp forest resources lost at the San Onofre kelp forest. To measure the success of the artificial reef using performance standards developed to ensure that the project objectives are met. If they are not met, to impose corrective measures to remediate the artificial reef if it fails to meet the performance standards. The project oversight will end after the mitigation requirement is met. Okay, this diagram shows the location of the Wheeler North Reef, the yellow rectangle. Phase 1, that it actually turned out to be 24 acres, was completed in October of 1999. Phase 2 reef of 152 acres was completed in September of 2008. Phase 1 and Phase 2 together was 176 acres after construction, and it was named the Wheeler North Reef in honor of Wheeler North, a pioneering kelp forest ecologist. The annual monitoring to evaluate the performance of the Wheeler North Reef began in 2009, and the diagram on the left-hand side of the screen shows the Wheeler North Reef in the rectangle. You can see the San Clemente Pier up into the northeast. There are 92 sampling stations that measure 50 meters by 20 meters. And these are distributed broadly across the reef. Each station is defined by a differential GPS coordinate and a compass heading. And you can see in this diagram that the pink or purple small squares are the Phase 1 reef, the green are the Phase 2 polygons, and the black lines indicate the pairs of transects that are used to sample. Okay. There's common marine life at the Wheeler North Reef. In particular, these images show you the sorts of organisms that we find on the reef. These include high densities of economically and ecologically important species, such as the spiny lobster and kelp bass, and also the ecologically protected species, such as the giant sea bass shown in the lower right. The goal of the Songs Reef Mitigation Project is to replace the kelp forest resources that were lost through the operation of Songs Units 2 and 3. 1 year of mitigation credit is given for each year that the Wheeler North Reef meets the performance standards. Wheeler North Reef is required to provide compensation for damages to kelp forest resources for a period of time equal to the lifetime operations of songs units 2 and 3, which is 32 years as determined by the Coastal Commission. Fulfillment of the Songs Reef mitigation requirement will occur when the number of years of mitigation credit accrued to the Wheeler North Reef equals the total number of years of operation of Songs Units 2 and 3, including decommissioning period to the extent that there are continuing discharges of cooling water. Okay, this slide is a summary of the Songs Reef mitigation compliance to date. And I'll just start with the top row, mitigation credit. This is actually through 2018 and does not include 2019. I'll get into that a bit in a moment. You can see that from 2009 through 2018, all of the relative standards were met. Hard substrate standard was met. Giant kelp was met 6 out of the 10 years. And the standard for invasive and undesirable species was met for all of the 10 years. The thing that was not met consistently was a fish standing stock of requirement that the reef produce a standing stock of 28 tons of fish. As I said, to date, or actually through 2018, Wheeler North Reef had not received any mitigation credit. This slide gives a little bit of detail for the standing stock requirement. And you can see that the dashed line up here is a 28-ton requirement. Initially, there was an increase through 2014, and then the standing stock dropped off thereafter, and it doesn't look like it's from these data to meet the mitigation requirement anytime soon, if at all. The data that were collected from 2009 to 2018 were used to determine why the Wheeler North Reef did not meet its mitigation standing stock requirement, and it was concluded that the reef was too small. In response to this work, it was determined that there would be an expansion of the Wheeler North Reef. The existing reef is 174 acres, 2 acres off of the area immediately after construction. And the new reef will now be 200 acres. So you can see outlined in the ellipse in red is the location of the existing reef, and outlined in the ellipses in yellow or gold are the location of the new reef. It will be a low reef, low cover design, similar to the San Onofre kelp bed and similar to phases 1 or phase 2 reef. And the coastal development permit includes protections for marine and tribal resources. The CDP was approved on March 7th of 2019, and construction began in the summer of 2020 to be completed in the summer of 2021. Post-remediation monitoring and post-remediation compliance and monitoring. This slide outlines an alternate approach. For compliance, the cumulative approach for fish standing stock and kelp area is instituted. Failing to meet the absolute standards of 150 acres of kelp or 28 tons of fish standing stock will no longer prevent the mitigation reef from being in compliance. So through 2018, if either one of those absolute standards was not met, Wheeler North Reef would not get any credit. Now we are using a cumulative approach. Maintain the current approach of relative standards and absolute standards related both to reef footprint and exotic or undesirable species. The mitigation credit applied moving forward is not retroactive, will not occur until the phase 3 reef is completed. The approach is consistent with the letter and the intent of the SONG CDP. For monitoring, there will be a decoupling of monitoring for fish standing stock and kelp and the relative standards. After 3 years of full monitoring shows compliance with the relative standards, then the compliance with monitoring will shift to annual site inspections. That concludes my presentation, and I'm now going to turn it over to Dan, who will give the results of the 2019 performance monitoring of the Wheeler North Reef. Okay, let me stop my share. Okay.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so I hear an echo. Do you guys hear an echo in my voice?
It's okay now.
All right, thank you. So as Steve mentioned, I'm going to talk about the results from the monitoring done last summer. And as he mentioned, the goal of the Wheeler North Reef is to compensate for the loss of kelp forest habitat caused by the operation of songs. And a variety of physical and biological performance standards were listed in the SONG's coastal development permit that are used to determine whether or not this goal is being met. And so there are two, let's see, how do I, there are two basic types of performance standards. And the first are what we call relative standards. And the relative standards require that the Wheeler North Reef performs similar to natural reefs in the region. Okay, the other type of standard are standards that we refer to as absolute standards. And unlike the relative standards, these standards are only measured at the Wheeler North Reef, and they're measured against a fixed value for the standard. And those values oftentimes are based on what the actual impacts to the San Onofre kelp forests were due to the operation of songs. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm going to talk first about relative performance standards, and they require comparisons to natural reefs. Okay, so to be successful, the Wheeler North Reef must sustain a community that's similar to those of natural reefs in the region. And so choosing the natural reefs is really kind of a big deal because it forms a basis on for comparison on determining the performance of Wheeler North Reef. So we spent a lot of time thinking about the criteria that were needed for selecting the natural reefs. And the criteria that we came up with are shown here. And the first and one of the important criteria is that the reference reef need to have a history of sustaining giant kelp. And the reason for that is that one of the goals of the artificial reef is to replace kelp forest resources, and kelp forests by definition are defined by giant kelp. So the reference sites need to have a history of sustaining giant kelp. Now the structure and assemblage of reef communities is really dependent on a number of things, and including depth. So the criteria for the reference reefs is they need to be located at a depth that's similar to the artificial reef. And they needed to be consistent of primarily a low relief reef that was preferably cobbles and boulders, which is the structure of the artificial reef, which is patterned after the San Onofre kelp forest, which is the kelp forest that the losses we're trying to compensate. And lastly, the artificial or the reference reefs need to be located within the local region of the artificial reef. And this is because oceanographic processes can alter the structure and function of reefs. And the closer reefs are together, the more likely they're to experience similar sorts of oceanographic conditions. And so with these criteria, the kelp forests at San Mateo and Barn, which are shown in green in this figure here, were chosen as the reference reefs for best meeting these criteria. Well, the Songs Coastal Development Permit envisioned a quantitative definition for similar to be used for judging the relative performance standards. And so the definition that we came up with is that for similar is that the 4-year running average for a relative performance standard at the Wheeler North Reef must not be significantly less than that at the reference reef, having the lowest value for that performance standard. And so the rationale for this definition is that for a given relative performance standard, the Wheeler North Reef should perform at least as well as the lowest performing natural reef used as a reference. And this definition recognizes that no two natural reefs are identical, but that any reef chosen as a reference should be able to serve as an acceptable standard, okay? And so the biological characteristics of a reef, whether it be a natural or artificial reef, fluctuate over time as well as space, right? And so a 4-year running average, the reason we use that is it takes into account this temporal variability when we're evaluating the reef performance. Okay, so there are a total of 11 relative performance standards that are used to evaluate the Wheeler North Reef, and they're shown here. The first 5 standards evaluate characteristics of the benthic reef community of macroalgae and invertebrates. And they include standards that focus on the abundance and diversity of algae and invertebrates. The second 5 standards on this list pertain to reef fishes. And they pertain to the density and diversity of fishes, but they also pertain to the ability of fish to actually reproduce and grow on the reef. So as indicated by the standards for reproductive rates and fish production. And the last standard on here, food chain support, it actually incorporates the other 10 standards by looking at the degree to which the benthic reef community of algae and invertebrates is used as food to support reef fishes. And so what I'm going to do in the next number of slides is I'm going to go through the 2019 monitoring results for each of these standards, okay? And so here's the first slide that I'm going to show, and the graphs that follow are all going to have the same format. So let me just kind of orient you to this format. All 3 reefs are shown in these graphs. The reference reefs, Barn and San Mateo, are shown in blue and red respectively, with Wheeler North represented by green triangles. All the graphs on the left are going to be a time series graph showing the annual value at the reefs since we started monitoring in 2009, whereas the graphs on the right represent the 4-year running average for 2019. And so in this particular slide pertains to the relative performance standards for understory algae, which have to do with the percent cover and number of species of algae on the Wheeler North Reef, which need to be similar to natural reefs in the region. So the top graph shows the percent cover, and the bottom graph shows the average number of species per transect. And what you see in both of these graphs is, aside from the very first year of monitoring, the Wheeler North Reef has consistently had a lower percent cover of algae and a fewer number of species than the 2 reference reefs. So when you look at the 4-year running average, you see that in both cases, the Wheeler North Reef is significantly below that of the 2 reference reefs. So we conclude that this standard, neither of these standards, was met by the Wheeler North Reef in 2019. Okay, there are a couple performance standards pertaining to invertebrates, and these 2 graphs show in the top graph the percent cover of sessile invertebrates, and the bottom graph the density of mobile invertebrates. So both of these standards pertain to the abundance of invertebrates. And what you see here is that, you know, again, in very early on in the first year of the reef, it took a little bit of time for the invertebrates to colonize the reef, but really since the first year or two, the cover of its sessile invertebrates and the density of mobile invertebrates has been either above or within the range that we've seen on the natural reference reef. So in this case, both the standard for the percent cover of sessile invertebrates and the standard for the density of mobile invertebrates were met in 2019. Okay, this figure shows data on the number of invertebrate species on the three reefs. Again, it shows that in the beginning, the reef was fairly depauperate. The Wheeler North Reef was fairly depauperate of invertebrates. It took a few years for the invertebrates to colonize and get established. And since about 2012, the number of species of invertebrates on the Wheeler North Reef has been largely within the range of the reference reefs, except for 2017-18, where it fell a little below. If you look at the 4-year average, we see that the Wheeler North Reef is slightly below the two reference reefs, but not significantly below. So this standard was met in 2019. Okay, turning to reef fishes. The top graph shows the density of resident fish, and resident fish are defined as fish that are greater than 1 year old, reef fish that are greater than 1 year old. And on the bottom graph is the density of young of year fish, or yoi, as we refer to them as. And these are fish that are born in the year that they're sampled. So they're 1 year or less, okay, in age. And what we see here is if we look at resident fish, the density of resident fish, we see that by and large, the three reefs were kind of fluctuated similarly over time, with the exception of 2011, which was kind of an anomalous year for Barn, where we saw a huge increase in the density of largely all the species of fish in 2011 at Barn, but we didn't see that in the other two reefs, okay? But over since then, the reefs have been quite similar, and the density of resident fish, the 4-year running average in 2019 at Wheeler North Reef was well within the range of the two reference reefs, so this standard was met. If we look at young of year fish, I should point out that these data are plotted on a log scale. And the reason for that is that there's been a large decline in the density of young of year fish beginning in about 2016. And that decline has been observed across all three reefs. But throughout the time series, you see that the Wheeler North Reef is largely within, for the most part, or very close to values observed in the two reference reefs. So the 4-year running average in 2019 for the Wheeler North Reef was quite similar to that of the two reference reefs, so this standard was met as well by the Wheeler North Reef in 2019. Okay, the top graph here has to deal with a performance standard relating to fish diversity. We see consistently throughout this time series in the annual graph that fish diversity at Wheeler North Reef was within or above the range of the reference reef. So this standard, the 4-year running average, was met in 2019. The bottom graph looks at fish production. And for fish production, the way we evaluate this standard, we use a select group of 5 indicator species. And fish production really reflects two things. It affects the growth of the fish, but it also reflects their density or biomass as well. And so what we see in this graph is again, the three reefs performing quite similarly, except in 2011, when fish production at Barn kelp bed was substantially higher than the other two reefs. And this is not because the fish were growing faster at Barn, it's just that there were more of them per unit area. So the units here for fish production are grams of fish produced per meter squared per year. And again, that's based on how much biomass is there to begin with and how much that biomass is increasing over time. So if you look at the last 4 years, Wheeler North Reef this standard has been met by Wheeler North Reef. Okay, there are also 2 performance standards of Wheeler North Reef. One pertains to the reproductive rates. And the idea here is that we just didn't want fish to grow or be present on the reef, but we wanted them to or the permit wants them to be able to reproduce as well, okay? And so what we do is use this same select group of indicator species to look at fish reproductive rates. And we do that by calculating what we call a fecundity index. And what that index is it measures the output of eggs by female fish over the course of the reproductive season. And it calculates an index that standardizes the mass of those eggs, or perhaps maybe it's the number, I think it's the mass, to the mass of the individual fish. Okay, so that's what the index is. You can see over time that it's been relatively stable over time, except, barn kelp in 2016 was a little bit of an anomaly. It showed a big increase where neither Wheeler North Reef or San Mateo showed that increase. But by and large, Wheeler North Reef has been within the range. The last couple of years, it's actually been a little higher. So the 4-year running average at Wheeler North Reef is within the standard, so this standard has been met. The bottom graph shows results for the food chain support standard. And for this standard, we look at 2 indicator species that actually feed on benthic invertebrates and macroalgae, or use the macroalgae for foraging habitat. And those 2 species are the California sheephead, which is a large wrasse that feeds on a lot of hard-shelled organisms, and the other species is the black surf perch, which feeds on small crustaceans that are found inhabiting much of the algae on the reef. And so what we do here is we look at the mass of the gut contents and we scale that to the mass of the individual fish. We then take an average of the 2 species that we kind of normalize, and that we use that to calculate this index. And what you see is this index actually fluctuates somewhat erratically over time. There's a couple of years where the Wheeler North Reef was substantially below that of the other 2 reefs. 2019, it was right in the middle of the 2 reefs. If you look at the 4-year running average, Wheeler North Reef is below, not substantially below, but significantly below that of the 2 reference reefs. So this standard was not met in 2019. So because natural kelp forests also vary greatly over time in their species composition and abundance, it's likely that they too would consistently not meet all the relative standards in a given year. Therefore, the evaluation criteria that we use for the relative performance standards is, for the Wheeler North Reef, it must meet as many of the relative standards as the lowest performing reference reef in a given year for that year to count towards mitigation credit. And the rationale here is that requiring the Wheeler North Reef to meet at least as many relative standards as the reference reefs achieves the desired goal of the Wheeler North Reef being similar to the natural reefs without requiring it to consistently outperform them. And so the way that we evaluate this collective group of performance standards is that the Wheeler North Reef and the 2 reference reefs are evaluated with respect to each other to determine whether each reef meets each individual relative standard in a given year. And then the total number of relative standards met by each reef in that year is then tallied and compared. So here is the tally and comparison for the 2019 data for the 11 relative performance standards shown as various rows in this diagram. The green circles indicate that that particular reef met that standard in 2019, and the red circles indicate that the standard was not met by that reef. And so if you tally up all these standards, you see that the Wheeler North Reef met 8 of these standards, San Mateo met 7 of them, and Barn met 10. And so from this, we conclude that the Wheeler North Reef met the mitigation requirement for the collective group of performance standards, relative performance standards for 2019. And what that suggests is that the Wheeler North Reef is actually behaving quite similar to natural reference reefs in the region with respect to standards pertaining to the abundance and diversity of organisms and various functions that are indicated by reef fishes and the benthic community. Okay, turning to the absolute standards. There's actually 4 absolute standards, and I'm going to talk about the first 2 of them first. And these first 2 standards pertain to hard substrate and undesirable invasive species. And these 2 standards, as Steve mentioned, have to be met every year in order for the Wheeler North Reef to receive mitigation credit. So the standard for hard substrate requires the Wheeler North Reef that the hard substrate on the reef, at least 90% of it must remain available for attachment of reef biota. Whereas the standard for undesirable and invasive species requires that these types of species can't become so abundant that they impair the important ecological functions of the Wheeler North Reef. And so the way that we evaluate these 2 standards is it's based on the value measured for the current year or the 4-year running average, whichever one of these is higher. Okay, so if we look at the standard for hard substrate, I just want to give you a brief little introduction on how this standard is actually measured. And it consists of 2 different types of data. The first type of data is our data on footprint area, which is measured in multi-beam sonar by Southern California Edison. And the second type of data are actually percent cover of the exposed rock, which is measured by divers in quadrats located along the 92 transects that we sample for hard substrate. And what we do is we calculate the area of exposed rock by multiplying the footprint area from the sonar surveys by the average percent cover of the reef as estimated from the diver surveys. And we compare this area of exposed rock in a given year to that was measured immediately after reef construction using the identical methods. And from that, we determine whether or not 90% of the reef is still available for reef biota. Now the divers actually measure 9 substrate categories. And what we do is we use these 5 categories shown here in this box as categories of hard substrate. And they include natural bedrock, different size classes of boulders, and cobble as well. Okay, so these are the data, the time series data and the 4-year average for the total area of hard substrate on the Wheeler North Reef. The horizontal line represents the as-built condition. In this case, it's about 72 acres, which represents the footprint area, 170 some odd acres, times the average percent cover of rock, okay? That's how we get the 70 some odd acres. And what we see over time is that amount of area on the Wheeler North Reef of available hard substrate declined over the first couple of years, but never really went below the 90% standard. And more recently over time, it's actually gone above the initial as-built condition. And the reason that we think it's gone above that is not because the reef footprint area is necessarily growing in size, but we think that the cover, our data indicate the cover is increasing over time. And we think that might result from when the rocks are deployed to the reef, they're intended to form a monolayer, but rocks invariably end up being piled on top of each other to some extent. And over time, we believe that some of those rocks are getting spread out a little farther. And so they're actually covering more of the bottom. There's also, we've noticed some indication of some scour in some areas as currents and stuff actually will scour the sand out around the rocks. The rocks are placed on a very thin layer of sand, so it doesn't take a lot of scouring to reveal the hard substrate underneath. So we think that's what's driving the higher than as-built conditions. But the bottom line is if you look in 2019, whether you look at the annual value or the 4-year running average, we're well above the 90% standard. So the hard substrate standard was met in 2019. Now the performance standard for undesirable and invasive species, as I mentioned, requires that the important functions of the Wheeler North Reef not be impaired by high abundances of these kinds of species. So undesirable species we've defined as they're actually native species, okay? But they're native species that can reach really high abundances, and what they do, when they do, they actually impair important functions of the reef. And two examples of that are, the first is sea fans, which can actually colonize, in particular, artificial reefs at such high densities, they cover the reef, and they, to the exclusion of other native species, and principally one being giant kelp. And so it's important that the Wheeler North Reef not develop such high cover of sea fans that it excludes everything else, okay? Another group of species that can become undesirable if they reach too high abundance are sea urchins, which if they get very abundant, they can form these dense grazing fronts that actually systematically go through and graze all the macroalgae on a reef. And this is a phenomena that happens worldwide, okay? And when they do that, both the diversity and important functions of the reef actually decline, or much lower in an area dominated by grazing sea urchins versus one where the urchins densities are quote, more normal. Okay, now invasive species are actually non-native species that are introduced into a novel habitat, and when they reach high densities, they can actually exclude native species and alter important functions of the reef. And two examples shown here of invasive species in Southern California are the green alga Caulerpa taxifolia, which is an escapee from the aquarium trade, which has been introduced into novel habitats in Southern California. And the other is the brown alga Sargassum horneri, which is native to Japan, and it's believed that it's been introduced through shipping. Okay, so one of the things, we don't actually measure a lot of important reef functions, but we do collect data that's very relevant to two very important functions provided by natural or artificial reefs. And those functions pertain to primary production of giant kelp, which we can estimate by the data we collect on the density of kelp fronds. And the other is nursery habitat for young of year fish, which we can estimate based on the density of recruitment density of young of year fish. Okay, so in these next couple of graphs, what I want to do is look at how, in this case, sea fans influence these two important functions on the reef. And now, in both of these graphs, the cover of sea fans is plotted on the horizontal axis, where in the graph on the left, the kelp net primary production, as measured by the dry kilograms of kelp per square meter of the bottom per year, is plotted in the left-hand graph, and the density of young of year fish is plotted on the vertical axis in the right-hand graph. Now, each of these points in these graphs represent the mean value for these variables on a given one of the 92 transects in 2019. And one of the things that jumps out to me in this graph is that sea fan cover on some of the transects has actually gotten to be quite substantial, over 15%, which is quite noticeable, right? Yet, despite the relatively high cover of sea fans, there's no indication that we found no significant relationship between the cover of sea fans and the primary production of giant kelp or the recruitment of young of year fish. And so based on this, we conclude that sea fans don't seem to be impairing primary production or nursery habitat for reef fish on the Wheeler North Reef. Okay, here's similar graphs, but instead of sea fans, we plotted sea urchin densities on the x-axis. And in this case, what kind of jumps out is that the density of sea fans is actually relatively low on the Wheeler North Reef. It's in all but 3 of the 92 transects, it's less than 3 sea urchins per square meter, which, you know, is actually a fairly low to moderate density of sea urchins. And importantly, we don't see, like with sea fans, we don't see any relationship between the density of sea urchins and primary production by giant kelp or the recruitment of young of year fish. So again, from this, we conclude that sea urchins don't seem to be impairing these important functions on the Wheeler North Reef. Now, the invasive species that we looked at were non-native species of macroalgae. We actually looked for non-native species of all different types of taxa, but the macroalgae are a particular concern to us since their ability to really dominate. And in our permanent transects, we had 0 recordings of these non-native species on the Wheeler North Reef. And so from this, we conclude that these species are not impairing the important ecological functions of Wheeler North Reef in 2019. So to summarize, there's really no evidence that we've found that undesirable invasive species are adversely affecting the ecological functions of the Wheeler North Reef. And so this standard then is assumed to be met in 2019. Okay, so unlike the 2 absolute standards for hard substrate in invasive species, the absolute standards for giant kelp and fish standing stock actually accumulate mitigation credit on an annual basis. And so they're assigned partial credit each year, okay? And so the standard for giant kelp, the goal of the artificial reef was for it to sustain 150 acres of medium to high density adult giant kelp. And adults in this case are defined as plants that have 8 or more fronds. Whereas the absolute standard for fish standing stock, the intent was for the reef to support a standing stock of 28 tons. Okay, every year that mitigation was required, the intent was to have at least a minimum of 28 tons of fish standing stock. And so the way that these 2 performance standards are evaluated for compliance moving forward is the annual standing stock of fish and the acreage of giant kelp at Wheeler North Reef are measured each year, and that this amount is summed over time until they reach a total equivalent, a cumulative total that's equivalent to the annual target. In the case of giant kelp, that's 150 acres. In the case of fish standing stock, that's 28 tons. But it's that annual target times the number of years of SONG's operation, which Steve mentioned was 32 years. Okay, so here's the data for giant kelp, time series over time. First year, we have very dense colonization in kelp, but relatively few adult kelp. So there really was not much in the way of area of adult kelp. But the 5-6 years following that, the reef was just maxed out with kelp. And so we had nearly every acre on the reef supporting giant kelp. I should say the way we estimate the area of giant kelp is we look at the proportion of the 92 transects that have greater than 4 adult kelp plants on them, and we multiply that proportion times the total acreage of the reef. We see that in 2016 in this time series, there's a dramatic drop in the acreage of giant kelp, and that coincided with the big warming event that we had. Kelp seemed to rebound in 2017, and in 2019, there was another big drop, okay? And we're not quite sure what the cause of that drop was, but we've not seen any new recruitment of plants. So what we think is going on is a continual attrition of adult plants with no replacement. So in 2019, the Wheeler North Reef earned a total of 36 acres of medium to high credit for medium to high density kelp. Now we can look at whether or not what the patterns we're seeing at the Wheeler North Reef are similar to those what we see in the reference reefs. And to do that, we scale the size of the reference reef to the current area of the Wheeler North Reef, which is 174 acres. And when you do this, you see that the Wheeler North Reef typically supported as much or more adult kelp as the nearby natural reefs at Barn and San Mateo. And importantly, you see that in 2019, the dramatic drop that we saw in kelp at Wheeler North Reef, it also occurred at San Mateo and Barn kelp, indicating that this is not just a problem at Wheeler North Reef. This is a region-wide problem that seems to be occurring or occurred last year, independent of Wheeler North Reef. Okay, these are the time series data for fish standing stock. Steve briefly showed this graph in his presentation. The point here is that since the reef was built, it's never supported 28 tons of fish. The last 5 years have been relatively stable. It's in 2017, it earned mitigation credit for 17 tons of fish. To put this in perspective with the natural reference reefs, again, we scale the natural reference reefs to the area of Wheeler North Reef. We see that the Wheeler North Reef has kind of consistently been, the standing stock has been bracketed by barn kelp and San Mateo kelp. You see this large spike in barn kelp in 2011. Again, that represents the huge increase in density we saw in that anomalous year. But other than that, Wheeler North Reef has kind of been in the middle of the two reefs. Okay, so it seems to be similar in terms of the amount of fish it supports per unit area or per acre of reef as the two reference reefs. Okay, so as Steve mentioned, the goal of the Songs Mitigation Project is to replace the kelp forest resources that were lost due to 32 years of operation of Songs Units 2 and 3. The way that we assign mitigation or assess mitigation compliance is we do it differently for different types of performance standards. For the combined relative performance standards and the two absolute performance standards pertaining to hard substrate and invasive and undesirable species, 1 year of mitigation credit is given for each year that the Wheeler North Reef meets all of these performance standards. And fulfillment of the mitigation requirement for these standards, collective standards, occurs when the number of years of mitigation credit accrued by the Wheeler North Reef equals the total years of operation of Songs Units 2 and 3, which has been determined to be 32 years. Now, the two absolute standards for giant kelp and fish standing stock are somewhat different from the other performance standards in that their evaluated mitigation credit is assigned to them independent of any of the other standards, okay? And the way it works for these two standards is their fulfillment of their mitigation requirements occurs when the total accrued acres of kelp or the tons of fish equals the targeted annual value. And that targeted annual value for kelp is 150 acres. And for fish, it's 28 tons. So it's that the product of that targeted annual value times the total years of operation of Songs, which is 32 years. So that's when that total accumulated value has been met, then these two performance standards have met their requirement. Okay, so to sum this up, this is my last slide, and it shows where we're at with regards to mitigation credit for the Wheeler North Reef. As I mentioned, Wheeler North Reef in 2019, it passed all the relative standards in terms of the collective assortment of standards, the way we evaluate them, and it passed the hard substrate standard and the invasive and undesirable species standard. So it earned 1 year of mitigation credit for 2019. It needs a total of 32 years. So it needs another 31 years of credit before this mitigation requirement is met. In the case of giant kelp, it earned 36 acres of credit in 2019. It needs a total of 4,800 acres, which is accumulated over the 32 years. And so it needs an additional 4,764 acres of kelp. Okay. Fish standing stock, it earned 17 tons this year. It needs a total of 896 tons. So that leaves 879 tons still to be required for the Wheeler North Reef to be in, to meet its mitigation requirement for fish standing stock. And that's all I have for my presentation. The next presentation, Jenny McGee from Edison will get into the remediation that's being done to help ensure that these mitigation standards will be met going into the future.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Steve, for those presentations. And I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions right now. Just as a reminder, there are going to be two different ways to ask questions. One, you're free to type a question into the Q&A spot down at the bottom of the screen. We'll try to get to those. And then the second option is to use the raise your hand function. And I will call on each person sort of one at a time and bring them in, unmute them, and you can ask your question. So we have a couple folks with hands raised, so I think we will start there. So Ken Nielsen, you're going to be first. I'm now bringing you into the meeting. You can unmute yourself from your end and then ask your question. Hi, Ken.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, good. Boy, is this a never-ending story. The last thing he said was 31 years more for the fish to meet the requirements. Is that how many millions of dollars are we going to spend to counting fish to decide how many fish are there? Unbelievable. I looked at a photo that they showed while we were watching this. It was a midwater photo, though I guess they don't count fish in midwater. And there was at least 15 black perch, 1 barred sand bass, a lot of blacksmith, and half the picture was hidden by the photo of him speaking. And I'm sure you saw that. Also, my one main question is, he mentioned 5 fish that are studied, and I don't know what 5 fish those are. I'd like to know that. And also, your report is excellent. The way this is coming out's unbelievably good. You did a good job on it. So anyway, that's my only comment. It's a never-ending story. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Dan, do you want to answer Ken's question
sure.
about the number of fish?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Ken.
Hi.
The 5 species are kelp bass, sheephead, sand bass. No, kelp bass, sheephead, sand bass,
Senorita.
senorita, and black perch. Is that correct, Dave? Yeah.
That's right.
That's the 5 species.
That's right.
And they were chosen to represent kind of different life histories, different resource uses, different levels of ecological importance. And that's how we kind of came. And basically we wanted to focus on species that were relatively common as well.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ken. Next up, we have Daniel Ellis. I'm now bringing you into the meeting. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey, Kate, thanks. So I have 2 questions. I have one for Dan Reed, which, Dan, you were talking about whether or not they met the relative performance standards and whether or not they were significantly below the 4-year average. And my question is, how are you defining significant? And then I have a follow-up question for Steve, and I'll make that one quick.
Okay, well, Daniel, what I'm going to do is allow Steve to answer this one. Is that good with you, Steve? Yeah, we use a statistical test, and Steve will tell you more about it.
Yeah, we use a statistical test, and the statistical test is a t-test, and we want to see whether the p-value for the t-test is less than the effect size. The difference between the impact and the control, or the reference and the control. And the reason we do this is to balance the type 1 and type 2 errors, balance the errors of saying there is a difference when there isn't, and balancing the effect of saying there is no difference when there is. So that's the technique that we use. And it's somewhat unique, but we thought that was important. So basically we're not canting it toward either, you could say, the SCE view or the public view. So we're giving equal weight to both entities. That makes sense?
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a great answer. That made perfect sense. And my
one second, Daniel, before you move on, I think that Pete Ramundi wanted to add something.
Pete's going to say floating alpha.
Yeah.
I think
Pete?
the other thing that we oftentimes leave out of this discussion is the absolute requirement that we make a decision every year. We have to come up with a conclusion every year, because one of the other options that we thought about early on before we came to the floating alpha was, well, you could just let it, if it was not significant, what do you do in the cases where the power is low? You could just say, well, we'll wait till the following year and find out what's going on there. Or we could wait till the following year and so on. But the one key consideration is we need to make an assessment every year as to whether it passes or does not pass every particular criteria.
Yep.
Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, Pete. And then Steve, my other question is just, when you were going over kind of the summary, so the reef is coming up way short in terms of fish stock, so they basically have to double the size of the reef. And I'm thinking about this from the perspective of if another project in the future had to do an artificial reef, and this was one of the performance standards, how well are we able to predict the size of the reef? If that question makes sense. Basically, we got it wrong by a factor of 2. But in the future, if we wanted somebody to do an artificial reef for a mitigation project, it'd be better if we can predict the size of the reef required to meet the fish stock performance standards. So I'm wondering how well we can do that in the future.
Well, let me just start by saying that the original recommendation, the as-built construction of the Wheeler North Reef was 176, but the original recommendation that was made was that the reef should actually be 300 acres. And SCE decided to go with the lower figure because they thought that they could design a reef that would be more effective, I guess, and that they could get the desired coverage or the desired standing stock with a smaller reef. But the modeling that we did, and actually Pete Raimondi took a big part of this, we used data from the phase 1 reef. So we had a long time series, and we related the standing stock to the area of various coverages of hard substrate. And we also looked at, the coverages were actually low relief reef. As Dan pointed out, the design of Wheeler North Reef was to mimic as well as we could the San Onofre kelp bed. But we also looked at a 100% cover high relief reef as well. And so the results of this modeling are actually on our website. And so there are different recommendations for area depending on the cover or whether it's high relief or low relief. So it was fairly comprehensive modeling exercise that was actually based on actual data that we had collected over a long period of time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. We're going to move on now to Nathan Spindle. Nathan, I am now bringing you into meeting. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thanks, Kate. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about some of the drivers behind the regional decline in fish recruitment over the past few years.
So I'll take a crack at that. The most abundant fish that recruit are small fishes, particularly gobies that have tended to be in cool water species. And so I think a large decline that we've seen in most recent years is due to the lack of particularly black-eyed gobies that have really kind of disappeared from regionally from kelp forests in Southern California. So that's probably one reason for it. You know, we've not, as Kenny mentioned in his question, a lot of juvenile fish recruit up into the canopy of the kelp. Our sampling is done on the bottom because that's how the sampling of the impacts was done to estimate back in the 70s and 80s. So we're trying to mimic our sampling to that of the impacts, but a lot of some of the small species recruit up in the canopy, and we're just not seeing those down on the bottom. So.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks.
One question that we have in the Q&A from Sarah Ebersole. How do we measure food chain support, and how do we interpret the values obtained? So Steve or Dan, I don't know who would prefer to answer that question.
So I can take a crack at it, and Steve, you can weigh in on this. Mark Steele, if he's around, he can weigh in as well. The work on food chain support is done by Mark Steele's lab at Cal State University Northridge. And what they do is they collect the targeted species for various purposes, and they dissect them and they actually weigh the contents of the guts of each species. And it's two species in this case, black perch and sheephead. So they weigh the contents of the guts and they scale the weight of the gut contents to the weight of the individual fish. And from that, they calculate an index. And then they calculate to weigh the two species similarly, they calculate a z-score for those two species, and that comes up with a standardized index that we use on gut. Essentially, it's gut fullness.
Okay, great. And I know that we have, let's see, I have one more question in the queue, and so we'll answer that one before we move on. Let's see, Ken, I'm gonna allow you to talk again, bring you into the meeting. Do you have another question?
Just one more statement that I want to make, that I've made at just about every meeting that we've had. And that's that when God wants kelp to grow, it grows. I've seen the kelp totally gone twice in my lifetime. Right now, the kelp's heading that way. 2019, you saw the kelp data. Wasn't looking good. And we had a giant red tide this year. What did that do to the kelp? I don't know. I guess we'll find out next year. But again, how many millions of dollars are we going to spend monitoring this kelp? I think we should give the monitoring a break and come back and look at it in 10 years. Thank you.
Thanks, Kenny. And that, I think we will move on to the next presentation by Jenny McGee of Southern California Edison, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions again at the end. So Jenny, if you want to share your screen and go ahead and give your presentation.
Okay, can everybody see the screen and hear me?
Yes, we can.
IT check. All right, well, thanks for inviting me for the opportunity to talk today at the workshop. That was some really good findings. We're happy to have 1 year of mitigation credit, so that's exciting news. I'm from Southern California Edison. I'm the project manager for the phase 3, which is the reef expansion project. I'll be talking to you today about our construction operations and where we go from there. Okay, a little bit of a review over kind of Steve's discussion and Dan explaining how we do the monitoring data and how we're using it. So the monitoring data was used to investigate the reasons why Wheeler North Reef was not able to sustain the 28 tons of fish annually. The conclusion of these studies were that determined that Wheeler Reef essentially wasn't large enough to sustain this volume of fish and needed to be expanded. Potential solutions for enhancing Wheeler's ability include, was essentially the foundation of those studies. The present configuration of Wheeler Reef is 174 acres, and it is 174 acres of low relief, low coverage reef, and is not sufficient to consistently meet the standing stock and performance criteria of the reef. So the question then is exactly how much more is needed. In these studies, they discussed in detail previous annual workshops, how Wheeler Reef is behaving very much like a natural reef. So as Steve and Dan went through the history there of the different performance by year, you can see it is lining up with the other reefs as we see in the relative criteria. We're just seeing a volume, insufficient acreage to support the fish volume and consistently the kelp growth that is needed to offset the impacts resulting from the operations of the power plant. So after the studies concluded that the reef, although performing naturally, was insufficient in size, Edison was provided with a series of solutions to evaluate what the next steps were to expand and actually build the remediation reef. So the studies concluded it needed to be larger. Three primary options were provided. Option one, which we refer to the first as the option one, which is a low relief, low rock cover. Additional acres would require 200 acres of reef. This is consistent with the reef that we had already built, the existing Wheeler Reef phases 1 and 2. Low relief with medium rock coverage would be a slightly higher coverage of hard substrate, would require fewer acres to meet the requirement to sustain 28 tons of fish. And then the last option, option 3, was a low relief high rock coverage, which was 81% rock coverage and 105 additional acres. So each of these was provided to Edison with a 95% confidence that each of these 3 options would be able to support the required tons of fish and kelp coverage. Having so much data on the Wheeler Reef, dating back to 1999 when the phase 1 was first constructed, we had a lot of confidence in the design of the existing reef, phases 1 and 2, which is the low relief, low coverage reef. The low relief, low coverage design also very closely mimics the impacted Onofre kelp bed. And so we know that not only does this design work and it's reliable in its ability to support these required standards, but also that it's offsetting the impacts associated with the operations of SONS. So Edison selected the 200-acre, the option 1, 200-acre low relief, low coverage reef. Another important note here that factored into our decision for this project as the preferred project was also that the low relief, low coverage, although it has the highest acreage of the 3, it had the lowest requirement of rock. So this design, option 1, was 150,000 tons of rock to meet the design specifications of the 200-acre reef. Rock source and transport is a key driver in the cost of the reef. And so this design cost also factored into our design selection here for this option. As I mentioned, this is the same design as the Wheeler North Reef, which is the same similar depths, 12 to 15 meters of depth. As I mentioned, we have known performance, and the construction of this project would require 150,000 tons of rock, 44 barge trips, and it would require material to be sourced from 3 separate quarries. So we would source the rock from 2 quarries located off of the Santa Catalina Island, the Empire Landing Quarry, and the Pebble Beach Quarry. And then it would also source rock from the La Piedra Quarry in Ensenada, Mexico. All 3 quarries are required to supply sufficient rock to construct the reef. Once we had a scoped project, we were able to go ahead and move forward with our permitting and licensing of that project. The defined project went through a CEQA process with California State Lands as the lead agency, leading the Supplemental Environmental Impact Report, Programmatic Impact Report. So this, of course, follows CEQA guidelines and evaluates all the resource categories for CEQA to evaluate and assess the impacts of constructing the reef. We acquired a water quality certification through the Water Resources Control Board. The 401 water quality certification was required for the deposit of materials into the ocean and regulates turbidity measurements as well as fuels or any spills. We acquired a 401 permit also under the Clean Water Act with the Army Corps of Engineers, who also functioned as the federal nexus of the project and engaged in consultation with NOAA to connect the marine fisheries protection. So the Army Corps of Engineers issued a 404 permit also for the deposit of material into waters of the United States. Coastal Commission, of course, issued a coastal development permit for construction development within the coastal zone of California. This was a permit specifically for the expansion and also revisited some of the monitoring details that Dan explained. As part of our CEQA compliance, one of the impacts of the project construction is we exceeded the NOx emission standards. The NOx emission standards were associated with the transport of the material. We did our very best to minimize the transport by using most efficient and cleanest vessels to transport the materials. However, the tugboats that are used to transport the rock are highly specialized, in finding low emission engines of these specialized tugs was not available. So what we did to offset our NOx emissions exceedance was we purchased air quality offsets through the Air Quality Management District to meet that requirement. In addition to, and I don't have a bullet here, but it's worth mentioning, in addition to the air quality, one of the other pre-construction operations that we did was to clean all of the vessels prior to construction. We had divers from state lands inspect underneath several of the vessels, and as a condition of the environmental impact report, and require cleaning of the vessels. So we did a diver cleaning of all of the vessels prior to construction as well. One of the other permits that we did amend is the California State Lands lease. So this project occurs within California State Lands jurisdiction offshore, and the existing reef was within a reef, a lease area that is in an agreement with Edison and Southern and State Lands Commission. The lease did not cover the area where the reef was to be expanded. So we needed to amend the lease to include the expansion of the reef. I should mention, sorry, I'm going to go back to this for just a second. So once we had a refined project, our early estimates for constructing the project were $30 million, $33 million. Once we had a defined project, we selected option one, and we went forward with all of the licensing of that scoped project. We were able to re-evaluate the total cost once we had a defined project and reduced our cost estimates to $20 million. Okay. So as Dan mentioned, this is really kind of a review of some of the discussion that we already have, but in part of the permitting process, there was a shift in permitting the expansion to cumulative standards. This defined our success criteria for the absolute standards for tons of fish, and for kelp, 896 tons of fish are now required, and 4,800 acres of kelp are now required. The other change that occurred that we through the licensing and permitting process out of the coastal development permit was the defined compliance period, which tied it directly to the operation life of the songs. So this decoupled decommissioning from the songs operation, which enabled us to align the reef with as mitigation to the songs operation. What this also did was it gave us a definitive monitoring period, which was important also for us to have a pathway forward to meeting compliance requirements. There is a reduced annual monitoring. This is after the 3 years of successful monitoring where we're able to attain the requirements that phase 1 and 2 essentially are not affected by the construction of phase 3. After 3 years, the annual monitoring will be reduced to inspections. Hard substrate monitoring will continue every 5 years. As I mentioned, the hard substrate monitoring is conducted by the sonar surveys as well as the dive surveys. And the cumulative approach, to put this in perspective, the cumulative approach and reef expansion, the combination of these two adjustments puts the project on track to meet absolute standards for within 20 to 30 years of success. Now we know that the relative standards are required for 32 years, given that the absolute standards are cumulative. They could be reached as early as 20 years to 30 years of success. This is in comparison to not constructing the remediation reef and the existing approach of monitoring on an annual basis would estimate at 100 years to success, if at all. Okay, a little bit about our construction of the reef of the expansion project. Our expansion project, a couple of numbers here for you. In 2020, we began the construction of the project on July 10th. We essentially constructed 60% of the project in 2020. We placed just under 92,000 tons of rock. We constructed 119 out of the 200 acres. We constructed 11 out of 22 polygons. We received 4 rock barges from Mexico and 23 rock barge shipments from Catalina. We successfully worked 18,981 man hours. Our construction dates are July 19th through September 30th. We placed an average of 1,600 tons per day and successfully operated last construction season with no safety incidents or spills. I didn't go over my picture, sorry. Up here on the top right, you'll see a picture overview of, this is the Empire Landing Quarry. This quarry is on the more remote portion of the island, and you can see it's much smaller. If you're familiar with the quarries on Catalina, it's much smaller than the Pebbly Beach quarry. There's limited amount of room here on the Empire Landing Quarry to stockpile rock, and so the timing of the stockpiling rock production and delivery is really precise in order to get just the right amount of rock loaded onto the barges and over to the construction site. Because of the limited amount of space on this quarry location, the rock production has to be paced with the ability to place it in the ocean. Down below, you see the Larcona tugboat. This is what our tug and rock operation, transport operation looks like. We have a loaded rock barge here being pulled by one of the tugs at the beginning of construction. So upon mobilizing, the tugboats bring the rock barge. The construction is operated by the derrick barge Long Beach, which has a large crane and the crane boom you can see on the bottom right picture. The derrick barge Long Beach is positioned in the ocean at the precise location and secured in place by 6 anchors. And then once the derrick barge Long Beach is positioned into place, the rock barge is brought over by the tugboat, and the 2 ships are coupled next to each other, and you can see this really clearly in the bottom left photograph of the rock barge being brought up to the derrick barge, which is in the foreground. The 2 ships are then coupled together And then, as you can see in the top left photograph, the crane boom on the derrick barge will lift the, I think it's a 986 caterpillar off of the rock barge and onto the derrick barge, or vice versa. In this case, they were swapping out caterpillars. There's two caterpillars. One is a backup, of course, in case we have any kind of equipment challenges with one of them, then we don't lose time. They can do a lot of repairs on the ship, so it's a good operation to have both on the ship so that they can conduct repairs as necessary and not lose any time during construction. This is each time a new rock barge is brought up to the derrick barge. This is how the caterpillar is then transferred onto the rock barge by using the crane. The top right photograph, you can see the caterpillar. This is the placement methodology. The caterpillar there on top of the rock barge, pushing the rock into the ocean at the precise location of the polygons. Bottom right is an overview photograph. You can see the two barges coupled together. Marine wildlife. A very important part of the project was to minimize any impacts the project had during construction to wildlife and to ocean habitat. So as a condition of the coastal development permit, as well as the environmental impact report, SCE staffed and State Lands Commission staffed marine wildlife observers on the ship during construction. The monitor roles were to be responsible for species identification of marine wildlife, to monitor the ship's operation in compliance with applicable laws, and always have the stop work authority to avoid marine animal collisions or harm. Last year during construction, the total number of animal sightings was 1,378. Total number of animals was 1,253. So you can see some of those were more than one sighting the same animal. The total stop work orders conducted in 2020 construction season was 17. They averaged 8.6 minutes. So we had, most of them were about 6 minutes long. We had one that was quite a bit longer. The exclusion zone, so the marine observers established an exclusion zone around the ship's operations. And the exclusion zone is an indicator for the marine wildlife observers. If they see an animal coming into the exclusion zone, they have authority to stop work and prevent any harm or damage, or any harm or harassment or animal collisions from occurring. For small animals, that exclusion zone is 500 feet. For large animals, it is 1,640 feet. The transport vessels, we took a slightly different approach because the transport vessels have a dedicated crew of tug operators and are very small and create some conditions where it's not safe for additional marine observers to be on the ship during the entire 24 or 36 hour transport. We worked with Coastal Commission to establish a training curriculum and worked with our contractors to have a dedicated watchman on each of the transport vessels. Each of them, they went through a 2-day training. In addition to their boatman experience, they went through a 2-day training that was conducted by a NOAA marine expert who instructed the boatman on species identification, how to avoid collisions, how to report, and also what to be documenting. So we also we have our boatmen collecting logs of each transport of all of the animals that they see during their transport operations. The marine wildlife observers on the derrick barge, we staff 3 observers daily. they take rotations, so there's 2 posts looking out in either direction of the ship, and then a third that's kind of on a break. And what this does is it alleviates any eye strain that could put the monitors under, conditions where they wouldn't be in their very best ability to perform this observation. So I believe it's 1 hour on each ship, on each post, and then 1 hour off. So 2 hours on, 1 hour off. And it's staffed collectively by consultants provided by Southern California Edison through Coastal Environments, as well as DUDAC, who is supporting State Lands Commission, and also providing an oversight function on behalf of State Lands Commission. Construction verification. So during construction, the placement of the rock, as you can see through having the discussion on the performance and the evaluation of our hard substrate and how all of this ultimately functions to support marine life, the placement of the rock is extremely important. So during construction, Connolly Pacific, our marine contractor, monitors the placement, and what you see on the left is a graphic that is in the CAD format, and each one of these lines is a line where rock is placed, and it's all based on getting the accurate spacing across. So it's placed sort of like a typewriter, if you will, where we're aligning the ship over each one of these lines and then pushing off the rock. They sort of feather it along the border of the rock barge and then push off once the placement of the rock barge is precisely over each one of these lines. The lines are generally 50 feet apart, and you can see notations on the screen here of the placement of each of those lines. All of these for this polygon 28 were 12-foot spacing. And they also calculate the acreage covered for that spacing and for that day. The different colors here indicate the day of operation. So you can see that this was constructed between the 20th and the 26th. But we also track the source of the rock. And so you can see on the right how that data collected during construction is also then captured and reflected in our final report developed by Coastal Environments, where we're able to articulate precisely where the different quarry rock was placed. The value for this is, of course, to have accurate as-built data, but also for us to identify if the rock density has any influence. And so we have impaired rock, which is more of a volcanic ash composite rock, and it's lighter in density. And so you can see that being placed and the location of the impaired rock emplacements colored by the reddish color. The Ensenada quarry, which is more of a granitic-based rock, placed there in the green. And then the Pebbly Beach, which is a conglomerate, is indicated there by the gold color. And finally, we also do construction verification using the multi-beam sonar survey to determine the footprint of each polygon. So you can see here, this graphic was this was collected. This is a sun-illuminated, color-shaded relief bathymetry image of polygon 18 that was collected in 2020 by Coastal Environments of one of our polygons that was constructed last year. So this gives us information on the accuracy. So we will overlay this and our design to verify our placement of the rock. There's a threshold of plus or minus 10 feet, and we've done very good job meeting to that specification thus far in the project construction. The other way that the construction is verified is by the dive surveys that were explained in detail also by Dan and Steve in doing the transects. So the dye surveys determine the percent cover of the hard rock, of the hard substrate. This information is collected every 5 years to evaluate the any changes in the perimeter of the hard substrate and any adjustments to the rock itself, but also to update any changes of the percent coverage of hard substrate. Okay, looking ahead to construction season 2, you can see in this graphic we have each of the phases articulated here in different colors. Phase 1 is indicated by the yellow squares to the southernmost region of the project. This was the experimental reef. The build-out reef, the mitigation reef, phase 2 is indicated in red. Phase 3 is indicated by the blue and yellow collectively, blue and green, excuse me, collectively. The green indicates our completion to date of phase 3, and the blue indicates polygons to be constructed. Some of the blue polygons are contingency polygons, so if there's for some reason a construction constraint, we're able to move into areas that are considered contingency. So not every single one of those is actually going to be built, but we have here an additional 58,000 tons that are to be constructed in 2021. We have 81 acres left to build, and we have 8 polygons still to construct, 13 trips from Catalina from Mexico, and 40 days of construction. We have already started this construction season, so we have started June 10th of this month, and we are scheduled to complete in July, on July 30th. Yeah, I think I already said everything I needed to say on this one. Yeah, so 40 days of construction for season 2. Construction during COVID, so we did some additional safety measures this year to make sure that we were bringing on staff and ensuring their safety during our operations. So our updated safety plan to reflect COVID safety include adjustments to PPE, which do require facial coverings and a personal hand sanitizer. We've put additional cleansing stations on deck. And once on board the Derrick Barge Long Beach, we are practicing social distancing or physical distancing. As you saw in the other photographs, it's quite large. So that's pretty easy to do while on the vessel. This particular photograph is our team on the transport vessel. So this is like a water taxi that we take out of Dana Point each day. And this is the tightest the crew is ever in proximity to one another. There's not a lot of room on this little boat. So we do make sure that everyone is wearing their facial coverings. And that's it.
Great, thank you, Jenny. Appreciate your presentation. So now I'm gonna open it up again for any additional questions. We can start with questions on Jenny's presentation, or you can ask general questions about the earlier talks or the program. And again, either feel free to raise your hand or put in a question into the Q&A box, either way. So I don't see any hands raised now. We'll wait another minute or two. Yeah, nothing in the Q&A either. Okay, well, one more. Okay, hold on one second. All right, Nathan, I'm inviting you into the meeting. You can unmute yourself. And actually, Jenny, would you unshare your screen? There we go, thank you. Okay, Nathan, you should be able to speak now.
Thanks, Kate. Jenny, thanks for that presentation. I was wondering if any of that bathymetry data might be openly available.
Yes, I've had that question come up a couple of times. I don't think we have any problems sharing the data. We give a report to the Coastal Commission. We'll be doing a final sonar survey after construction this year of the entire reef. And to my understanding, that is public knowledge. So it should be available to you.
Cool, thanks.
That's right. Great, thanks, Nathan. All right, our next speaker, Ken, I'm gonna allow you to speak now. You should be able to ask your question. Go ahead and unmute yourself. There you go. All right, hold on one second. Let's try that again. Okay, Ken, let's try that again. Try to unmute your line and see if we can get your question in.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we're good.
Okay. Thanks, Jenny, for your report. I was just going to bring up a point that I get called by everybody in San Clemente for what's going on with the construction and this and that. And I'd paid attention pretty much to the plan, but I had no idea they were going to be doing so much, putting so much rock in the southern portion off San Mateo. And people were asking about that. So you might just make sure you let everybody know what's going on. And you know, we'd seen the maps and everything else. And after seeing the one today, I see that you're going to be filling in on a lot of different areas, and I wasn't aware of that. So anyway, that's all. Thank you. And also the crews of the vessels are doing a great job of when lobster season came, they got out of the way. They didn't run gear over, and they did a good job. So thank you.
Thanks, Kenny. I'll be sure to give the crew that feedback because I know it towards the end of construction, it's a little bit difficult, but we'll be well out of the water before lobster season this year. We have been communicating on a various number of media outlets. So we've been on Facebook Live, we've been on some community groups, and there were several stories coming out in San Clemente Times and the Orange County Register. There's also some information I think we're passing through the Song's website as well. But you can always go to the Song's website and ask questions there as well through that email. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question. Let's see, from Jonna. Do you have any rocks ever been lost from the barge during transport in heavy seas?
Rocks fall off of the barge?
Mm-hmm.
But no, we haven't. No, they're moving very slow. So each of the vessels are transporting at about maximum 8 knots. They're really more like 4 if nautical miles per hour. So they're moving pretty slowly, and no, we've only had rocks go right where they're supposed to be. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, last chance. If you have a question, please go ahead and raise your hand, or go ahead and type a question into the Q&A or the chat box. I'm trying to monitor both here. So I don't see any more right now. So I think with that, we'll go ahead and conclude our workshop for today. I want to thank everybody for attending, both all of the attendees today, as well as our scientists, and SAP, and Jenny McGee from Edison. Thank you very much for participating today. If you have any follow-up questions, I will go ahead and type my email address into the chat box. So most of you probably have it, but if you don't, you can always feel free to send me a quick question. And if I can't answer it myself, I'll pass it on to the appropriate person. So I'll do that right now. And other than that, I think we are done for today. Thanks everybody for attending. And oh, and one quick plug, there is a workshop on Thursday at the same time, 1:30, for our wetland. And Steve Schroeder and Mark Page will be presenting a similar presentation on both on the performance and some other issues related to the wetland. So you're all welcome to join that. If you haven't already signed up or gotten the invite, feel free to email me and I will make sure to get it to you. So I'm going to type my email address in the chat there, and everybody should have it if you need it. So thank you very much for attending, and have a great rest of your day.